Good morning. Okay, so I'm very tired. This is in the middle of show week for doing Hairspray. We've now done 4 shows. We've got another 2 today, but I just wanted to try and put something together to help out with this. The possibility and probability that myself and a number of my friends will be providing music lessons online. So I've had a bit of experience of this, so I just wanted to sort of put something together in case it was of any help. This is all generally my opinion, so feel free to ignore it. But in terms of my experience, I've taught 1 pupil remotely. So when I moved from Cardiff to Keynsham, I still had a pupil in Cardiff who I was doing guitar lessons with on a weekly basis for an hour on a 1-to-1. Every week, and so I've got some experience on it, but I definitely don't have any experience in kind of like group sessions or anything, which I know a number of my friends teach. So what we are looking to actually achieve is to replicate the experience of 1-to-1 tuition in a digital context. So you have to kind of break that down into what that actually means. And so for me, it's about two-way communication. It's about I need to be able to see and hear, and you need to be able to see and hear. If we're talking about me being the teacher and you being the pupil, for example, we need to be able to share our resources. So this goes to, sheet music, to books, to PDFs, and then to backing tracks. Also, to if I am accompanying you, I need to be able to do that, which is a whole different thing, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we have ourselves some goal setting, which is just, standard, educational things like we start here, we need to get to there, etc. One of the quite nice things about getting more used to digital things and about sharing of resources is the sense that you kind of become better at sharing recordings and stuff like that, which I think is a really, really good way of gauging progress. And ultimately, you want to make it fun and interactive. And that's going to be so much down to personal teaching styles and stuff like that. So I'm not going to really talk about the fun and interactive. We're going to be talking more about the cold and logical way of actually teaching. So the minimum setup that I think from both sides of the communication that both the pupil and the teacher need a device such as a computer or a laptop or a tablet. They need a webcam so that we can see one another, a microphone so that we can speak to one another, speakers so that we can hear one another, internet access so that communication is possible in the first place, communication software so that we can actually communicate with one another, and then finally, and it feels so bizarre how low down the list this is, our actual instruments and sheet music, which is sort of the point. Okay, so for the ideal setup, what I would recommend, obviously a device. The internet connection, you really want this to be wired rather than wireless. The lag of Wi-Fi, though it's getting better from what it has been in the past, it still can't compete with a wired connection end to end. So especially when you're thinking of the amount of lag or just connectivity issues we might have, the most stable and just sufficient way we're able to do this is through wired connections, though that can be difficult, and I do appreciate that. A webcam, one of the interesting things to point out about webcams is that we probably want them to be mobile. So rather than connected to your tablet or stuff like that, you're going to really need to think about camera angles and to make sure that you're able to see both the face and the instrument of the pupil and teacher respectively. Even in a digital space, eye contact is super, super important, and I think people underrate that quite considerably. A microphone quality does matter. I mean, I was thinking this through, you do want to get a semi-decent thing, so because we're talking about music and we're talking about instruments, so something like a USB microphone rather than just the built-in one to your webcam is the ideal. Again, I'm saying this all from an ideal perspective. Of course, we just need a microphone, but if you can get hold of a slightly more decent one, then that'd be fab. Headphones. So in the previous thing, I said speakers, but really headphones are what we're looking for. The main reason for this is that your headphones will isolate the sound that you're hearing from your microphone. And so you won't have the chance of a feedback loop. In general, to my understanding, and I don't actually have proof of this, but this is my experience anyway, things like Skype or Google Hangouts or FaceTime I haven't mentioned FaceTime specifically because that's Mac only, and I'm trying to be as overarching as I can. So things like Skype or Google Hangouts or more recently Zoom, they work very well to try and reduce the feedback by what you hear and then what you say, identifying the two different frequencies and removing one from the other, so you're less likely to have feedback. But in the case of music, this becomes problematic. If, for example, I'm playing an A and you need to sing an A, we're both singing an A, they both have the same frequency, so they will both be removed. And it means that it can be, I have found that it is harder to actually hear, and because the software is trying to remove feedback because it's not specific for music, and why would it be? Anyway, so just something to be aware of. Headphones are a good thing, and in difference to, say, these wired headphones, might be worth looking for Bluetooth headphones, because cables will get in the way. And especially, I just think of this in terms of, say, violins or any instruments which involve this kind of area. I think probably just violins, and not being a violin player, I don't actually have first experience, but it might just be a bit of a faff, whether or not the headphones get in the way of the shoulder rest or anything like that. Might be. Your own instrument and stand. This is a bizarre thing to me, but as a piano teacher, I have found many of my pupils not to have keyboards at home or usable things, and also not many of them having music stands. And I think these are two things that actually can't be taken for granted, how important it is to make sure that the pupil has exactly what they need at home. And then the last thing is just whatever makes you feel comfortable in your environment. So from a teacher perspective, primarily, you're going to be sat at your desk teaching, or stood at your desk, depending on your feelings, for like hours, and you want to make sure that you are perpetually invigorated and feel good about what you're doing, because it can be a much more difficult experience to be enthusiastic digitally than when you are able to share laughs in person. Just something I've personally found. We'll come to that in a bit when we talk about the sort of negatives of this sort of setup, because enthusiasm and attention span is a real problematic area as far as I'm concerned. So do whatever, or set up your space with whatever fun, colourful, brightly lit, or like whatever things that will make you feel good about going to work every day, because I think people are going to find that very difficult, especially in the early steps. And from a pupil perspective, it's really strange having to now be taught, in your home via the internet, via, the person on a screen or whatever like that. So just make sure that the space is comfortable, that there aren't any siblings also playing computer games in the same room or anything, just stuff like that. Just cultivate the environment within which you are in. Software then. Yeah, so again, these are just a couple of examples of free things, but yeah, so, Skype, Google Hangouts, Zoom. So Zoom was mentioned to me in a Facebook post. I hadn't personally heard of it, but it's a specific educationally centered bit of communication software. I personally have no experience. It seems to be pretty good. People seem to rate it quite highly. But I have only really used Skype, and I suspect that if you're working for an organization in some sort of sense, that they will say, you'll need to do all of this through, I work for Baines, for example, for Bath and North East Somerset Music Service, and I suspect that, we'd be said, okay, so Baines, you need to use your Baines email accounts and your Baines Skype accounts and blah, blah, blah. So I think we'll pretty much be told which bit of software to use in that particular instance. But if you're freelance, then you can use whatever you want. The one and the most important thing I'll say for that side of things, though, is whatever you do use, Skype, Google Hangouts, Zoom, or if all of your pupils have an iPad or iOS, then you could use FaceTime if you wanted. Make sure that everyone uses the same thing. Consistency is the number one thing here, and especially for people who are slightly less tech literate, just knowing one piece of software intimately and knowing all the different problems and how that can be resolved is going to solve so many issues versus, well, I'm using Skype. Well, today and the next pupil I'm using Google Hangouts, so I have to load up that, and then the next pupil's a Zoom account. Oh, what's my account? And it just becomes very problematic. So consistency is the number one thing I would say in terms of communication communication. And then documentation, just as a quick thing, you're going to want to write stuff down. You can't physically write stuff in books. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing. You're going to have to ask your pupil, okay, so on this bar, I want you to circle that note, and stuff that you take for granted. Think of all those interactions, just the small little things. Go tautologies. It's really, really important for us to start thinking in terms of anything physically, how can I represent that digitally? And just documentation is just one which is important to be aware of. And obviously there are loads of free options. So a couple of things specific for the teachers and a couple of things specific with the pupils. One of my favorite things about doing sort of online tuition as a teacher was using notation software alongside this. So I've named a couple of free options like Dorico SE or Sibelius First or MuseScore. Those are all free. Those are all multi-platform as well, which is the whole point. So yeah, on like iPads you can use like Notion and stuff like that, but like that's again first costs money, second of all isn't around that. Digitally androgynous, as I was taught. No, digitally agnostic. That's the term I was taught once, and I thought it was fab. So it doesn't care what platform you use; it can be used. So digitally. That's interesting. Oh, cool. I didn't know I could do that. Great. Digitally agnostic. So the reason that notation software is really, really good is it meant that you could like literally write examples. And obviously, especially when you are teaching notation, this is a big thing. Plus, you can actually, do playback. You can actually say, okay, this is what it actually sounds like. Do. You could set up click tracks, set up backing tracks, all those kind of things. There's actually some really interesting things that I've experienced with using notation software, which I honestly slightly miss when I do one-to-one lessons. So there is room for exploration. I mean, that's the thing. There's always going to be benefits in some sort of capacity. And then for the pupil specifically, you've got to think about that at their end, they're going to need any physical aids that you might use. I personally don't use a lot of these, but I know some friends of mine who use like a little on violins, use a little kind of like mouse or something like that to make sure you've got the space around the neck. I believe, I'm not a violin teacher, please don't yell at me. Or like, putting stuff on the back of people's hands when they're playing piano so that they stay there, etc., etc. I don't use this stuff, but just consider that the other party is going to need to get, the pupil's going to need one. And it's what I said earlier, actually. So their own instrument and music stand, that's a big old deal. Did I actually put... Yeah, I mean, I put that into the thing which is needed for everyone. And so the other bit of software, which I think is really interesting that pupils might be interested in or might find useful, are screen recordings. So... this is a very interesting point of contention as far as I'm concerned. It's, that interesting line between we can record stuff so that we can look back on it and we can do all these things versus I'm always on camera and I'm always being recorded by my pupil and I feel really uncomfortable with that. And so I think that's very much on a case-by-case basis. I personally have never really had a problem with it, but I can entirely understand why... that might be those feelings. I was also initially thinking this would be useful for the teacher, but then I started thinking of all the data protection, all the GDPR, all the child protection things. I was like, you know what, let's just scrap that entirely. So from the pupils' perspectives, they might want to consider having some kind of screen recording things, but ultimately that all has to be consensual. We all have to make sure that both parties are aware that that's happening, etc., etc. Okay. And so this is just sort of a general sort of like slide to talk more about a concept of just the fact that you need to think more about your lessons before you go into them. So, from a practical sense, again, from my experience of guitar, are your pupils able to tune their own instruments? And if they can, then can they do so before the lesson? Don't waste time in your lessons. And if they can spend that moment, before, while Skype's loading up or whatever to actually tune up their instrument, that'd be great. I completely appreciate, especially with the younger pupils, that's going to be so difficult and it's going to require an element of potentially like teaching the parents or teaching the guardians or carers or etc., etc. So that's a different kind of discussion of how to go about doing that. it's those sort of little things that we have to kind of start thinking ahead of. And, do they need sheet music? Do they need to print stuff off beforehand? You want to make sure that you can go into these digital lessons with everything already there, because you can't hand them anything. They can't, if they've forgotten something, you can't give them a copy of the book or whatever. And it's just, there are so many interesting sides to that. That I think everyone's going to handle in a slightly different way. And then I've just put more tuning, because tuning is just such a mess always. So work out a strategy for getting your instruments tuned. Go piano. Because actually going back to the tuning thing, like one of the most interesting things, whatever, I'll talk about it in the benefits and difficulties. I'll come back to it. Right, so some of the benefits of this, I've talked about notation software. I think it's really, really useful. I think recording the lessons can be super useful, especially for when, you get the inevitable, I don't know where to, the pupil going, I don't know, I couldn't practice because I didn't know where to put my hand. It's like when you literally have a recording of the lesson of me teaching you this stuff. And lessons, you can cover a lot of ground, and especially if it's being recorded, for them to then look back over, you can then introduce topics, and you can go, and, I know you won't fully understand it in this first thing, but I only have to explain it at once because you can listen back to it. I'm not saying that's ideal, but I'm just saying that's a possibility. And it's easy just to send extra bits of resources, YouTube links or Spotify things or PDFs or MP3s, just to send things digitally. And I think one of the nice things is, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is just that it encourages a sense of sharing content, I want to say, but in a not quite in that sense. Sharing like recordings, making things happen between lessons. So like, you could say, you could take recordings each week, and not only is that super easy to do, even from a teacher's perspective, you could just take audio recordings, and you can encourage, and I want you to be sending me recordings of you doing this each week and stuff like that. I think it's like a really valid and valuable way of assessing progress, because, you can actually show like, okay, you saw a month ago, this is what you sound like, play. And then this is what you sounded like today. Play, and you can actually do compare and contrasts. I think there's some really interesting things which are possible in that kind of space. Difficulties. So obviously there are difficulties, and I think one of the most interesting ones. No, I think there's a couple of interesting ones. So a lot of it all depends on the tech setup of both parties. I'll go through these in order because they're all pretty interesting for different reasons. So, accompanying pupils during playing and warm-ups can be difficult due to internet connection speeds. So accompanying can be a complete nightmare if there is any amount of lag. In general, I would avoid doing it where possible and instead make backing tracks, record stuff, send it over, have them play along to it. It can be really difficult, especially when both parties don't have wired internet connections. There's just a bit too much lag. I have done it. Like, it has worked to an extent. It's certainly possible, but is difficult and requires both parties buy-in, basically. And warm-ups, again, I think of this mainly from a singing perspective as well. That can be really tricky, especially, we're talking about so many things, and singing is already such a personal experience. To then be encouraging to do that in the home, we go to a lot of social space, and feeling comfortable and making sure that the environment can be good is something which can be hard to cultivate at home versus just in a practice room. I wish it wasn't hard to cultivate at home. I wish all families were completely and 100% encouraging throughout. And I personally don't have that much experience of it where families aren't that aren't encouraging, but it's something just to be aware of. Can be harder to maintain focus. So this is really for both parties. Like, oh my gosh, how the level of engagement decreases so much when we're communicating via Skype. It is so easy to just casually open a browser and go Wikipedia diving or going on Facebook or social media, stuff like that, or like anything else which you obviously on paper you totally know you're not meant to do under any capacity, but it's so easy and it's so tempting. And also from the pupil side of things, it's way harder for them to take to almost take anything like even remotely disciplinary seriously if they're being told it through a screen. Like, it's a very different experience. And it's so there's all sorts of really odd behavioral things that I think should be very much considered when we're talking about this kind of stuff. Anyway, the pupil locations and the text setups are all constantly different. I mean, this is just a minefield. They need to find a dedicated space. The pupils need to find a dedicated space. You as a teacher need to find a dedicated space where they can have their instrument, where they can set these things up, where the computers can get to them, like in a Terminator stuff. I'm sorry, where the computers are, where they can access their device and their webcam and their microphone, and where they can set this up with minimal fuss. Otherwise, they're not going to bother, or they're not going to want to do it. If they take like 15-20 minutes to set up for a 15-20 minute lesson to then pack up for 15-20 minutes, it's going to be a complete nightmare. So the location to which the lessons are being held is so difficult to get right. And I've had really strange experiences of this in the past. So that's a hugely problematic area that I think is vastly underrated. Good luck. So I just wanted to dedicate an entire slide to camera angles. Camera angles are so difficult to get right for instrumental teaching. I mean, I don't know. Again, this is just my perspective, but in general, it's kind of like, okay, so I'll move up to my face, and then I'll move it down to my, let's actually get the thing up, so I know there's going to be some feedback. But like, okay, I'll move up to my face now, and then we'll move down to my instrument, and there's all sorts of like waggling and stuff like that, and it just all gets completely farcical. So just finding a camera angle that just works is so difficult. So the main things that we're trying to achieve through a camera angles are eye contact with our pupils, hugely underrated in digital space. Like, it makes a huge difference being able to see faces. Viewing of their instrument. I think piano is probably the hardest to get this right. So I guess for piano, you do it, and again, I'll get a bit of feedback here, but like, from the side, so we make goodbye my headphones. So we'll have our actual like keyboard here, so that the pupil's head can be here and looking back and forth, etc., etc. So kind of side on for piano. I mean, to be fair, how we would normally teach piano. And then for instrumental things, it's just a case of being able to find that kind of the space which works. Good luck. I think there are some instruments where that is easier or harder. But I'm sure everyone's going to have their own experience with that. Guitar is really difficult to get a decent angle because you have to put like the camera really far away to get both the face and the person. And it's a really weird feeling when you're just, say, focusing on a disembodied instrument for a bit. And I feel it has all these sorts of weird difficulties that's very hard to get right. And then viewing the sheet music. This is a really, really weird one. Like, first off, you definitely 100% need a physical copy of whatever music they're playing. And you need to be able to gesture correctly. You need to teach them, like, the pupil where bar numbers are to know exactly what, because you can't point at music. You can hold up your sheet and go like, I want to go from here. But yeah, that can get really, really tricky. It might be a case of like, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but like, if you're, say, teaching on a tablet or something like that, you do a screen share showing the music, showing your mouse cursor, and then like, okay, so I want you to, and then you click on, I want you to play from here, and you click on what you want to do. You could click, drag, highlight. Because I mean, again, going back to the benefits of this kind of stuff, screen sharing is super, super useful, and using PDFs and annotating PDFs and stuff like that can be really, really useful. I mean, maybe you want to do that. Maybe you want to try and get PDFs of all of your music. I mean, that's going to require a lot of scanning, but it's probably going to be worth it, because then you can actually annotate each week's copies of stuff like that. But yeah, everyone's going to find their own path, do what works for you. But I think there's going to be a lot of learning, and it's going to be very uncomfortable in the short term. And I think it can have positive outcomes. I think it's just going to have a temporary huge drop on how it feels. General thoughts. please test this setup before using it. Oh my goodness me. Actually take some time. Skype, if you're using Skype another teacher, test out one another's digital setups, go through it, iterate and improve, test it out, see what works, what doesn't work, because you need to make sure that everything is solid from your side, because the pupils will have all of the issues and you don't want to be in that position. You want to be solid. You want to say, well, I set my timer for 15 minutes and if 10 minutes of it was technical difficulties because they had a problem, that was their problem. You have to, as a teacher, you have to make sure that you are completely on top of what software you use. Again, this is why I'm talking about consistently. Just use Skype or just use Google Hangouts or just use Zoom. You know, just use one thing, understand absolutely how it works so that you can then help other people. That's going to be strange for everyone. Yeah. And I mean, I've said I'm always happy to help. I mean, if you want to ever message me and go like, I want to test out my setup, I will always be a dummy pupil for you or whatever. That's fine. I mean, the second point for GDPR, it's pretty obvious. You know, it's probably going to be best to use work accounts as normal. You know, any sharing of data, of pupil data, you should be doing. And again, I work for Bath and North East Somerset Music Service. You know, we're very, very strict on that, and I think that's just going to be apparent. It's just an obvious thing to say, but for everyone that's going to be different. And just as a thing, like, you know, just to repeat, eye contact is just as important digitally, so do consider the camera angles. I then dedicated a slide to it because, you know, this is just a waffle. So the last slide that I wanted to kind of bring up was just if you had to make a list of what to request from a pupil, it would be this. So pupils should be providing a device with a webcam, microphones, headphones, and an internet connection. There are ways that they can be better, but those are the basics. For the webcam to be set up to show both the face and the instrument of the pupil, this is, again, that's just a necessary. We just got to make that happen. It's going to be so difficult. People will or won't have tripods. People will or won't have webcams which can be mobile. I'm going to guess most people won't. I'm going to roughly expect that most people are just going to do this off an iPad. Or, you know, and I don't know if the schools can provide these things. Probably not. I don't know what's going to be provided. I don't know if, even when I talk about these devices, whether or not they're going to be provided by, say, like, as I said, Baines Music Service, or, you know, and that causes so many difficulties, and I completely understand. So much of this has just got to be you're just got to play with the hand you dealt. To download, so for the pupils again, so to download communication software from a working, you know, with a working account, and again, everyone has to test that this works before going into day one. Like, yeah, you have to make sure it's okay. And to be very explicit, it's this version, it's this Skype. You know, you might have to be like explicit, like it's very specifically this version of Skype, or it's this version of Google Hangouts. Maybe you're going to have to make some resources explaining, maybe just a PowerPoint, maybe just a video explaining the stuff. You know, just having a friend holding a camera while you just kind of like log into your account and stuff like that, just to show what you have to do. You know, I think and again, I know this is rambly and waffly, but I think there's just going to be so much hand-holding. I think there's going to be so much everyone having to support one another. I mean that in the best sense. Like, I mean, the more that people work together for these kind of scenarios and to share understanding, the better, which is basically why I'm doing this video. Like, I'm far from an authority on it. Like, I'm absolutely not an authority, but I just wanted to kind of get the ball rolling for people who might need help. Anyway, to test that the setup works before the first lesson, number one thing, absolutely, if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work, and any prep you do is wasted. It's the equivalent of them not showing up to the lesson. Yeah. To ensure the device provided can read a PDF and docs. I mean, yeah, that's kind of low down on the list, but like, again, if you're trying to use, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just a good thing to have. There's going to be uses for it. There's going to be reasons. And where possible, to tune the instrument before the lesson, because tuning is fun. And I think that's basically everything that I wanted to talk about. At every point, if you have any questions that I could help you out with, just get in touch. Don't hesitate to ask. either comment on this video, email me at, so my personal account is going to be rich@richjacksonmusic.com, or, you know, whatever. If you have any questions, I just want to be able to help people get through what's going to be a really interesting and initially very, very difficult time. I think it's so important that everyone helps everyone else out. Anyway, so good luck, have fun, and if you need anything, just get in touch. Thank you very much. Take care.